Good evening, it's 7 minutes past 9 p.m. On Sunday, the 2nd of July 2023, I'm going to be sharing the lives of the saints from BUTLER'S for the 2nd of April. I'll begin with just two prayers. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O angel of God, my guardian dear, to whom God's love commits me here, ever this night be at my side, true light to God, to rule and guide. Amen. Prayer to Saint Michael the Archangel. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend me in the day of battle. Be my safeguard against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, I humbly pray. And do you, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the other evil spirits who prowl through the world seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. The first saint is Saint Francis of PAOLA, founder of the MINIM FRIARS, AD 1507. Saint Francis was born about the year 1416 at PAOLA, a small town in Calabria. His parents were humble, industrious people who made it their chief aim to love and to serve God. As they were still childless, after several years of married life, they prayed earnestly for a son, and when at last a boy was born to them, they named him after Saint Francis of Assisi, whose intercession they had specially sought. In his 13th year, he was placed in the Franciscan friary at San Marco, where he learnt to read and where he laid the foundation of the austere life which he ever afterwards led. Although he had not professed the rule of the order, he seemed even at that tender age to outstrip the religious themselves in a scrupulous observance of its requirements. After spending a year there, he accompanied his parents on a pilgrimage, which included Assisi and Rome. Upon his return to PAOLA, with their consent, he retired first to a place about half a mile from the town, and afterwards to a more remote seclusion by the sea, where he occupied a cave. He was scarcely 15 years old. Before he was 20, he was joined by 2 other men. The neighbours built them 3 cells and a chapel, in which they sang the divine praises, and in which Mass was offered for them by a priest from the nearest church. This date, 1452, is reckoned as that of the foundation of his order. Nearly 17 years later, when the number of disciples had been augmented, a church and a monastery were built for them in the same place, with the sanction of the Archbishop of Cosenza. So greatly were they beloved by the people that the whole countryside joined in the work of construction. Several miracles are said to have been worked by Saint Francis during the erection of the building, 1 or 2 of which were vouched for in the process of canonization. When the house was finished, the saint set himself to establish regular discipline in the community, whilst never mitigating anything of the austerity he practised. Though his bed was no longer a rock, it was a plank or the bare ground, with a log or stone by way of a pillow. Only in extreme old age would he allow himself a mat. Penance, charity, and humility formed the basis of his rule. Charity was the motto he chose, but humility was the virtue which he inculcated continually on his followers. In addition to the 3 usual monastic obligations, he imposed upon them a 4th, which bound them to observe a perpetual Lent, with abstinence not only from flesh, but also from eggs and anything made with milk. Fasting he regarded as the royal road to self-conquest, and deploring, as he always did, the relaxation in the strict rule of Lent, which the Church had been obliged to concede, he hoped that the abstinence of his followers might set a good example, as well as make some sort of reparation for the lukewarmness of so many Christians. Besides the gift of miracles, Saint Francis was endowed with that of prophecy, and long afterwards, writing to Pope Leo X for the canonization of Saint Francis, the Bishop of Grenoble, uncle to Bayard, the Chevalier sans peur et sans reproche, wrote, "Most Holy Father, he revealed to me many things which were known only to God and to myself. Pope Paul II sent one of his chamberlains into Calabria to inquire about the truth of the wonderful things that were reported of the saint. Upon seeing a visitor approach, Saint Francis, who was busy with the masons over the construction of his church, left his work to greet him. The envoy attempted to kiss his hand, but this Francis would not allow. He protested that it was for him to kiss his hand, but this Francis would not allow. He protested that it was for him to kiss the hands which for some 30 years had been sanctified by offering the holy sacrifice. The chamberlain, surprised that Francis should know how long he, a stranger, had been a priest, did not disclose his mission, but asked to speak with him, and was led within the enclosure. Here he expatiated eloquently on the dangers of singularity, and censured Francis's way of life as too austere for human nature. the saint attempted humbly to vindicate his rule and then to prove what the grace of God would enable single-minded men to bear. He lifted out of the fire some burning coals and held them for some time in his hands unscathed. It may be noted that there is a record of several similar examples of his immunity from the effects of fire. The chamberlain returned full of veneration for the holy man, and the new order received the sanction of the Holy See in 1474. At that time, the community was composed of uneducated men, with only one priest. They were then called hermits of St. Francis of Assisi, and it was not until 1492 that their name was changed to that of Minims, at the desire of the founder, who wished his followers to be reckoned as the least minimi in the household of God. St. Francis made several other foundations in southern Italy and Sicily, but he was threatened with a serious check to his activities. For Ferdinand, King of Naples, annoyed at some wholesome admonitions he and two of his sons had received from Francis, gave orders for him to be arrested and brought a prisoner to Naples. The official arrived to execute his order, but was so impressed with the saint's personality and humility that, returning awestruck without his prisoner, he dissuaded Ferdinand from interfering in any way with so holy a man. Indeed, all Italy was then ringing with the praises of St. Francis as a saint, a prophet, and a wonder worker. It happened in 481 that Louis XI, King of France, was slowly dying after an apoplectic fit. Never had anyone a stronger passion for life or a greater dread of death, and so irritable and impatient was he that everyone feared to approach him. Realizing that he was steadily growing worse, he sent into Calabria to beg St. Francis to come and heal him, making many promises to assist him and his order. Then, as his request was not acceded to, he appealed to Pope Sixtus IV, who told Francis to go. He at once set out, and King Louis gave 10,000 crowns to the herald who announced the the saint's arrival in his dominions, and sent the Dauphin to escort him to Plessis-les-Tours. Louis, falling on his knees, besought Francis to heal him. The saint replied that the lives of kings are in the hands of God and have their appointed limits. Prayer should be addressed to him. Many interviews followed between the sovereign and his guest. Although Francis was an unlearned man, Philip de Comines, who often heard him, wrote that his words were so full of wisdom that all present were convinced that the Holy Ghost spoke through his lips. By his prayers and example, he wrought a change of heart in the king, who died in resignation in his arms. Charles VIII honoured Francis as his father had done, and would do nothing in the affairs of his conscience, or even in state matters, without his advice. He built for his friars a monastery in the park of Plessis, and another at Amboise, at the spot where they had first met. Moreover, in Rome, he built for the Minims the monastery of Santa Trinita del Monte on Pincian Hill, to which none but Frenchmen might be admitted. Saint Francis passed 25 years in France and died there. On Palm Sunday, 1507, he fell ill, and on Maunday Thursday assembled his brethren and exhorted them to the love of God, to charity, and to a strict observance of all the duties of their rule. Then he received viaticum barefoot, with a rope round his neck, according to the custom of his order. He died on the following day, Good Friday, being then 91 years of age. His canonization took place in 1519. Besides the rule which St. Francis drew up for his friars, with a correctorium or method of enjoining penance and a ceremonial, he also composed a rule for nuns and regulations for a third order of persons living in the world. Today, the number of members of the order of Minims is considerably reduced. They are mostly found in Italy. I'm not going to read the small print. That's the end of that saint's life. I'm now going to share with you martyrs, the saints APPHIAN and THEODOSIA, AD 306. Now, APPHIAN is spelled APPHIAN, and Theodosia is THEODOSIA. Martyrs. I hope you can hear, because the microphone is not as close as it could be if I had the ability to make it closer, but I don't. I've got it in front of the computer on the desk, and I'm on a table in front of it because the font is very small in the BUTLER'S, so I've got no choice but to worry about whether I can read it or not. Excuse me a moment, because I still have a cold. The saints. amongst the martyrs of Palestine, from Eusebius knew personally, and whose sufferings he has described, there are two who seem to have made a special impression upon him by reason of their tender age. One was APPHIAN, or APPHIAN, a youth in his 20th year, and the other was a girl of 18, called THEODOSIA. APPHIAN, born in Lycia, had passed through the then famous schools of Berytus in Phoenicia, where he had become a Christian, and he went to live at Caesarea when he was 18. Not long afterwards there came instructions to the governor of that city that everyone should attend the public sacrifices. Thereupon APPHIAN, communicating his design to no one, not even to us, says Eusebius, with whom he lived, went to the place where Urban, the governor, was offering the sacrifice, and slipping unnoticed through the guards, laid hold of the magistrate's arm and stopped him, exclaiming that it was impious to neglect the worship of the true God, to sacrifice to idols. The guards fell upon him, beat him, and kicked him, and he was thrown into a dark dungeon, where he remained 24 hours with his feet in the stocks. The following day, when his face had become so swollen with blows as to be unrecognizable, his sides were torn until his bones and entrails were exposed. To all interrogations he made but one reply: I am a servant of Christ. Lighted pieces of flax, dipped in oil, were next applied to his feet. But though the fire burnt to his bones, his constancy could not be shaken. When urged to sacrifice, he only said, I confess Christ, the one God, and the same God with the Father. Finding no weakening of his resolution, the judge condemned him to be cast into the sea. Immediately after the sentence had been carried out, there ensued a prodigy, of which Eusebius says, there were as many witnesses as there were inhabitants of Caesarea. The sea and city were shaken by an earthquake, and though the saints' feet were weighted down by heavy stones, his body was cast up on the shore. Excuse me a moment, sorry. Of Theodosia, who appears to have suffered also under Maximinus, Eusebius writes in the following words: after the persecution had lasted over 5 years, on the 4th day, before the nones of April, actually on the day of the Lord's resurrection, there came into Caesarea a holy and very devoted girl called THEODOSIA, a native of Tyre. She approached some prisoners who were sitting before the praetorium, awaiting sentence of death, with the intention of greeting them, and also probably of asking them to remember her when they came into the presence of God. She was set upon by the soldiers as though she had done something impious or criminal, and was brought before the president. He was in a savage mood, and, moved by some cruel impulse, he condemned her to horrible tortures, her sides and her breasts being torn to the bone by means of iron teeth. Then, as she was still breathing, and her face bore a happy smile, he caused her to be thrown into the sea. That was her fate. Now we're moving on to another saint from a question the 5th century, and her title is Saint Mary of Egypt. The story of Saint Mary of Egypt seems to be based upon a short and not incredible account contained in the life of Saint Cyriacus, written by his disciple Cyril of Scythopolis. The holy man had retired with his followers into the wild and apparently uninhabited desert beyond Jordan. One day, 2 of his disciples suddenly saw a human figure which escaped into some bushes, but which they afterwards tracked into a cave. The figure told them not to approach because she was a woman and naked. But upon being interrogated, she informed them that her name was Mary, that she was a great sinner who had been a public singer and actress, and that she had come there to expiate her former life. The 2 returned to tell Saint Cyriacus what they had seen and heard. Upon the occasion of a second visit, which they paid to the cave, they found her lying dead, and they buried her on the spot. Round about this narrative, there grew up an elaborate legend which attained enormous popularity in the Middle Ages, and which is illustrated on the old glass windows of the cathedrals of Bourges, Auxerre, and elsewhere. It may be summarized as follows, and there's a lot to read. In the reign of Theodosius the Younger, there lived in Palestine a holy monk and priest named Zosimus, who, having served God with great fervour in the same house for 53 years, was divinely directed to leave his monastery for one near the Jordan, where he might learn how to advance still further on the path of holiness. He found that the members of this community, on the first Sunday in Lent after Mass, used to disperse in the desert to pass in solitude and penance the time until Palm Sunday. It was at that season, about the year 430, that Zosimus found himself a 20 days' distance from his monastery, and sat down one day at noon to say his psalms and to rest. Perceiving suddenly what appeared to be a human form, he made the sign of the cross and finished his psalms. Then, looking up, he saw a white-haired, sun-tanned figure, which he took to be a hermit, but which ran away as he went towards it. He had nearly overtaken it, and was near enough to crave its blessings, when it exclaimed, "Father Zosimus, I am a woman. Throw your mantle to cover me, that you may come near me." Surprised that she should know his name, he complied, and they entered into conversation. In reply to his inquiries, the woman told him her strange story, with many expressions of shame and penitence. "My country," she said, "is Egypt. At the age of 12, while my father and mother were still living, I went without their consent to Alexandria. I cannot think without trembling of the first steps by which I fell into sin, or of the excesses which followed." She then described how she had lived as a public prostitute for 17 years, not for money, but to gratify her lust. At the age of about 28, curiosity led her to join a band of people who were going to celebrate at Jerusalem the feast of the Holy Cross, and even on the journey she continued her evil courses, corrupting some of the pilgrims. Upon their arrival in Jerusalem, she tried to enter the church with the rest of the congregation, but an invisible force held her back. After 2 or 3 ineffectual attempts, she withdrew into a corner of the outer court, and for the first time a full realization of her sinfulness swept over her. Raising her eyes to an icon of the Blessed Virgin Mary, she besought with tears the help of the Mother of God, vowing herself to a life of penance. With a lightened heart, she was now able, without any difficulty, to enter the church, to venerate the cross. And as she returned to the icon to give thanks to Our Lady, she heard a voice which said, "Go over Jordan, and thou shalt find rest." At a baker's where she bought loaves, she inquired the way to Jordan, and started off forthwith, arriving the same night at the church of St. John the Baptist on the bank of the river. Here she made her communion and crossed the Jordan into the wilderness, where she had remained ever since, about 47 years, as far as she could judge. She had seen no human being and had lived on edible plants and on dates. The winter cold and the summer heat had sorely afflicted her unprotected body, and she had often been tortured by thirst. At such times she had been tempted to regret the luxuries and wines of Egypt in which she had formerly indulged. These and other assaults beset her at night and day, almost unremittingly, for 17 years. But she had implored the intercession of the Blessed Virgin, and the divine assistance had never failed her. She could not read, and had never had any human instruction in holy things, but God himself had taught her the mysteries of faith. At her request, Zosimus undertook not to divulge what she had said until after her death, and promised to meet her again beside the Jordan on the Maundy Thursday of the following year to give her Holy Communion. The next Lent, Zosimus made his way to the selected meeting place, bearing the Blessed Sacrament, and that same Maundy Thursday evening beheld Mary standing on the opposite bank of Jordan. After she had made the sign of the cross, she proceeded to walk upon the water until she reached dry ground beside the astonished priest. She received communion with deep devotion, following it by the recitation of the opening words of the Nunc Dimittis. From a basket of dates, figs and lentils, which Zosimus offered, she would only accept 3 lentils, and she thanked him for all he had done, and commended herself to his prayers. Then, with a final entreaty that he would return a year later to the spot where they had first met, she departed over the river as she had come. But when Zosimus went back into the desert to keep this second appointment, he found Mary's dead body stretched out upon the ground, whilst beside her on the sand were traced these words: Father Zosimus, bury the body of lowly Mary. Render earth to earth and pray for me. I died the night of the Lord's Passion, after receiving the divine and mystic banquet. The monk had no spade, but a lion from the desert came to his assistance, and with its claws helped him to dig her grave. Zosimus resumed his mantle, which he treasured henceforth as a holy relic, and returned to tell his brethren all his experiences. He continued for many years to serve God in his monastery until a happy death released him in the 100th year of his age. Well, I'm going to go against what I want to do is I'm going to try to read the very, very tiny font, because I'm curious, as this is the strangest saint I've ever come across. It says, this legend has had a remarkable diffusion and popularity in the East. In its developed form, it seems to have been the composition of Saint Sophronius, Patriarch of Jerusalem, who died in AD 638. Besides the digression referred to above, which Cyril of Scythopolis introduced into his life of Saint Cyriacus, Sophronius had before him a somewhat similar story told by John Moscouche in the Pratum Spirituale. This nucleus was elaborated into a narrative of respectable dimensions with the aid of sundry borrowings from the life of St. Paul of Thebes. St. John Damascene, who died in the middle of the 8th century, makes long quotations from the developed life of St. Mary of Egypt, and apparently regarded it as an authentic record. A good account of the whole matter is furnished by H. Leclerc in DAC, and I can't read the rest, where a full bibliography will be found. Sorry, there are a few more words, but I can't read them. My eyes will not allow it. But someone must be praying for me, because today something strange happened, particularly very strange. I've been praying about my eyes for a long time, because I've been told I have cataracts. One hospital wanted to do it, and then the optician said not ready yet, one of them. Well, so anyway, they're not done. And I can't read the board. It's quite a distance from where I sit. I cannot read the numbers on the board for the hymns. I'm always asking the lady near me to tell me what they are. Well, 2 weeks ago, I was able to read, and I couldn't believe that I was reading the board. And the same thing happened today. So I think the Lord must be touching my eyes, because normally I couldn't read what I've just read. So that's twice today I've been able to read something I thought I couldn't read. So the Lord is doing something to my eyes. So I was able to read every hymn. I was so astonished. I got my pen out, and I wrote the hymns down on something I had to my hand. I'm just wondering where I put that, but I did. I wrote the hymns down. Now I've dropped something, but he'll have to stay on the ground. It's a bookmark. So that's the end of that saint. Now I'm going to read one with a very strange name. Saint NICETIUS, like nice, NICETIUS, or another way of spelling it is NIZIER, NIZIER, Bishop of Lyon, AD 573. Saint NICETIUS, or NIZIER, a great uncle to Saint Gregory of Tours, was descended from a Burgundian family and had been destined for the church from an early age. Even after he was ordained priest, he continued to live in his own home with his widowed mother, whom he obeyed as implicitly as the lowliest of her servants, although he valued letters so highly that he insisted that every boy born on the estate should learn to read and to know the Psalms. Yet he made a practice of personally assisting the servants and dependents in their manual labours, that he might carry out the apostolic precept and have something to give to those that suffered need. When Saint Sacerdos, Bishop of Lyons, lay on his deathbed in Paris, he was visited by King Childebert, who urged him to nominate a successor. The aged prelate accordingly named his nephew, NICETIUS, who in due time was approved and consecrated. A man of blameless life, he was determined opponent of loose and uncharitable speech, which he denounced on every possible occasion. He became famous for his power of exorcising unclean spirits, and in the course of an episcopate which lasted nearly 20 years, Saint NICETIUS revived and improved ecclesiastical chant in his diocese. Saint Gregory of Tours relates a number of miracles that occurred at his tomb. So that's all they have to say, and he was AD 573. Continuing with the saints for this day, April the 2nd, is Blessed John PAYNE, P-A-Y-N-E, martyr, AD 1582. I think I'll just take a sip of water. I feel I ought to. Hold on a moment. Excuse me. Thank you. Blessed John PAYNE. Oh, Peterborough, that's not far from me. It's not that far. It's beyond King's Lynn, of course. Peterborough appears to have been the birthplace of Blessed John PAYNE, but nothing is known of his family except that he had a brother who was an ardent Protestant, a fact which has given rise to the conjecture that he himself was a convert. We first hear of him as a seminarist at Douai, where he arrived in 1574 for his theological training. Less than 3 weeks after his ordination to the priesthood, he was sent on the English mission, his destination being Essex, whilst that of Blessed Cuthbert Maine, his fellow traveller, was Devonshire. At Ingatestone, in the house of Lady Petra, whose steward he was supposed to be, Blessed John had his headquarters, but he also found a lodging in London. He seems to have been very active, and his efforts, unlike those of many other martyrs, were crowned with immediate and visible success. As he writes in one of his letters, on all sides, in daily increasing numbers, a great many are reconciled to the Catholic faith, to the amazement of many of the heretics. And he adds that this augmentation makes it essential that Douai should send more priests to minister to them. Less than a year after his arrival, he was arrested at Lady Petra's and imprisoned, but was released within 4 weeks and left England some 9 months later. Why, and for how long, a period history does not tell. We know that he was back in Essex by Christmas 1579, for the man who afterwards betrayed him stated that he first came across the Martyr at Lady Petra's at that date, and there seems no reason to doubt the statement. Ingatestone Hall was then a regular refuge for priests, and its priests' hiding place, 14 feet by a feet and 10 feet in height, was accidentally rediscovered in 1855. Mr. Payne's second and final arrest was in Warwickshire on a charge of conspiracy, but Walsingham, who examined him, reported to Burghley that he thought the accusation baseless. Nevertheless, as it was clear that he was a priest from Douai, it was deemed undesirable to let him go, although the law declaring it treason to be ordained abroad had not yet been passed. Accordingly, a fresh charge of plotting to murder the Queen, the Lord Treasurer, and Walsingham was trumped up by his denouncer, who pretended that Payne had tried to enlist him in the conspiracy. This informer was John Eliot, Judas Eliot, as he came to be called, who had occupied positions of trust at Lady Petra's and in other Catholic families, but was a profligate, an embezzler, and a murderer. To escape punishment and to obtain money, he denounced no less than 30 priests and caused the capture of Blessed Edmund Campion. On this man's accusations alone, Mr. Payne suffered 8 months' imprisonment in the Tower without being tried. Several times he was tortured, notably on August 31st, when, according to the diary of the Tower, John Payne, priest, was most violently tormented on the rack. On the night of March 20th, 1582, he was roused from sleep and hurried off to Chelmsford jail without being allowed to dress or to take his purse, which was appropriated by Lady Hopton. At the assizes, Eliot repeated his charge. There was no other witness, neither was there any attempt made to obtain one. The martyr declared his innocence and protested that it was against divine and human law that he should be condemned on the evidence of one man, and he a notoriously infamous character. But his fate had already been sealed. Sentence of death was passed. The date of the execution fixed for April the 2nd, and it was duly carried out. The crowd, who were well affected towards him, interfered to prevent the hangman from quartering and disemboweling him before he was dead. The feast of Blessed John Payne is kept in the dioceses of Northampton and Brentwood on the morrow. The next blessed is Blessed Leopold of GAICHE, Gaiche, AD 1815. Blessed Leopold was born at GAICHE in the Diocese of Perugia, the son of humble parents, and was christened John. A neighbouring priest helped him with his education, and in 1751, when he was 18, he received the Franciscan habit in the friary at BUTLER'S, taking the name Leopold. After he became a priest in 1757, he was sent to preach Lenten courses of sermons, which soon made him famous. As the result of his eloquence and fervour, numerous conversions took place, enemies were reconciled, and penitents besieged his confessional for 10 years, from 1768, when he was made papal missioner in the States of the Church. He held missions in several dioceses, and even after he had become minister provincial, he continued his apostolic labours, fired by the example of Blessed Thomas of Corey and of St. Leonard of Port Maurice. He was anxious to find a house to which missioners and preachers could retire for their annual retreat, and where other brethren and friends of the order should come for spiritual refreshment. He had, however, many difficulties to overcome and disappointments to meet before he could realize his desire on the lonely hill of Monteluco near Spoleto, when in 1808 Napoleon invaded Rome and imprisoned Pope Pius VII. Religious houses were suppressed and their occupants turned out. Blessed Leopold, a venerable old man of 77, which is my next birthday, 77, was obliged to abandon his beloved convent and with 3 of his brethren to live in a miserable hut in Spoleto. While there he acted as assistant to a parish priest, but afterwards he had charge of an entire parish whose pastor had been driven out by the French. Then he was himself imprisoned for refusing to take an oath which he considered unlawful. His imprisonment, however, was of short duration, for we soon find him giving missions once more. His fame was enhanced by his prophetical powers and by strange phenomena which attended him. For example, when he was preaching, his head often appeared to his congregation as though it were crowned with thorns. With the fall of Napoleon, Blessed Leopold hurried back to Monteluco, where he set about trying to establish things as they had been before. But he only survived for a few months, dying on April 15th, 1815, in his 83rd year. The numerous miracles reported to have taken place at his grave caused the speedy introduction of the process of his beatification, which reached a favourable conclusion in 1893. That is the end of the saints for April the 2nd. So we'll cease there, and hopefully I will do April the 3rd next time. Very interesting they were indeed. So I thank you so much for listening. May God bless you and heal you. I'm sending you his peace in abundance, and may you always be happy and joyful in the Lord. I've still got the butlers, you see, that's meant for April, May and June, and I know I didn't record them all, so I have to make an appointment to return it, and I haven't done so yet, but I will. This week I'll make the call. God bless. Thank you. Good night.